rationalize, and in general put their heads back together. Adjourn, reconvene the meeting after people have had a chance to recover, and solicit their views of the decision at that time. This will help everybody accept and learn to live with the unexpected. If good decision-making appears complicated, that's because it is, and has been for a long time. Let me quote from Alfred Sloan, the General Motors president who spent a lifetime preoccupied with decision-making. Alfred Sloan said this: "Group decisions do not always come easily. There is a strong temptation for the leading officers to make decisions themselves without the sometimes onerous process of discussion. Because the process is indeed onerous or burdensome, people sometimes try to run away from it. A middle manager I once knew came to us straight from one of the better business schools and possessed what we might call a John Wayne mentality. Having become frustrated with the way Intel made decisions, he quit. He joined a company where his employers assured him, during the interview, that people were encouraged to make individual decisions which they were then free to implement. 4 months later, he came back to Intel. He explained that while he could make decisions without consulting anybody, so could everybody else."
This completes Side 6 of High Output Management by Andrew S. Grove. Even after you learn to leverage your activities to get high output and become an expert in handling meetings and decision-making, you still have one other key ability to master, and that key ability is planning. You'll hear important information on this subject as we continue on the next side. Please load the next cassette and continue. This is Side 7 of High Output Management by Andrew Grove. An important managerial role is planning, and this involves answering 3 important questions. What will the environment demand from you? Where will your business be if you do nothing different from what you are now doing? And what more or less do you need to do to produce what your environment will demand? You'll hear specific answers to these questions and more as we continue. Here is side 7.
Even after managers learn to leverage their activities to get high output and become expert in handling meetings and decision-making, they still have one other key ability to master. That key ability is planning. Now, most people think planning is one of the loftier responsibilities of management. We all learned somewhere that a manager plans, organizes, controls. In fact, planning is an ordinary, everyday activity. For instance, as you're driving to work in the morning, you are likely to decide whether or not you need gasoline. You look at the gauge to see how much gas you have in the tank, you estimate how far it is you need to go, and you then make a rough guess as to how much gas you need to get to and from your office. By comparing in your mind the gas you need with the gas you have, you decide whether you should stop for gas or not. This is a simple example of planning. The dynamics of planning can best be understood by going back to our basic production principles. As we learned earlier, the key method of controlling the future output of a factory is through forecasting demand and building to forecast. How one plans at the factory can then be summarized as follows. Step 1. Determine the market demand for product. Step 2. Establish what the factory will produce if no adjustment is made. And Step 3. Reconcile the projected factory output with the projected market demand by adjusting the production schedule. Your general planning process should be similar. Step 1 is to establish projected need or demand. What will the environment demand from you, your business, or your organization? Step 2 is to establish your present status. What are you producing now? What will you be producing as your projects in the pipeline are completed? Put another way, where will your business be if you do nothing different from what you are now doing? Step 3 is to compare and reconcile steps 1 and 2. Namely, what more or less do you need to do to produce what your environment will demand? Let's consider each step in more detail, starting with Step 1, environmental demand. Just what is your environment? If you look at your own group within your organization as if it were a standalone company, you see that your environment is made up of other such groups that directly influence what you do. For example, if you were the manager of the company's mail room, your environment would consist of customers who need your services. That would be everyone else in the company. Vendors who are able to provide you with certain capabilities in the form of such things as postage meters and mail carts. And finally, your environment would include your competitors. Of course, you don't have competitors internally, but you can compare your service to one like United Parcel as a way to judge performance and set standards. What should you look for when you examine your environment? You should attempt to determine your customers' expectations and their perception of your performance. You should keep abreast of technological developments like electronic mail and other alternative ways of doing your job. You should evaluate the performance of your vendors. You should also evaluate the performance of other groups in the organization to which you belong. Does some other group, like the traffic department, affect how well you can do your work? Can that group meet your needs? Once you have established what constitutes your environment, you need to examine it in 2 time frames, now and sometime in the future, let's say in a year. The questions then become, what do my customers want from me now? Am I satisfying them? What will they expect from me 1 year from now? You need to focus on the difference between what your environment demands from you now and what you expect it to demand from you a year from now. Doing a difference analysis is crucial, because if your current activities satisfy the current demands placed on your business, anything more and new that you do should be done specifically to make up for this difference. How you react to this difference is, in fact, the key outcome of the planning process. Should you, at this stage, consider what practical steps you can actually take to handle matters? No, that will just confuse the issue. What would happen to a factory, for instance, if the marketing organization adjusted its demand forecast on the basis of its own assessment of the manufacturing unit's ability to deliver? If marketing knew they could sell 100 widgets per month, but thought that manufacturing could only deliver 10, and so submitted a demand forecast of 10 units, manufacturing would never tool up to satisfy the real demand. The second step of planning is to determine your present status. You do this by listing your present capabilities and the projects you have in the works. As you account for them, be sure to use the same terms or currency in which you stated demand. For instance, if your demand is listed in terms of completed product designs, your work in process should be listed as partially completed product designs. You also need to look at timing. You must ask yourself, will every project now moving through be completed? Chances are no. Some will get scrapped, and you have to factor this into your forecasted output. The final step of planning consists of undertaking new tasks or modifying old ones to close the gap between your environmental demand and what your present activities will yield. The first question is, what do you need to do to close the gap? The second is, what can you do to close the gap? Consider each question separately, and then decide what you actually will do. Evaluate what effect your actions will have on narrowing the gap, and when they will have an effect. The set of actions you decide upon is your strategy. Much confusion exists between what is strategy and what is tactics. Although the distinction is rarely of practical significance, here's one that might be useful. As you formulate in words what you plan to do, the most abstract and general summary of those actions meaningful to you is your strategy. What you'll do to implement the strategy is your tactics. Frequently, a strategy at one managerial level is the tactical concern at the next higher level. Here are a couple of examples of the way managers at Intel have gone about their planning responsibilities. As he defined his present environment and status, Bruce, an Intel marketing manager, found that he had only 3 people in his department who could possibly handle a huge inventory of projects. As he looked at his desired future status, he concluded that every single one of the projects had to be completed. Not finishing everything would result in significant extra cost and far more effort later. Bruce was faced with a genuine dilemma, especially since the budget kept him from hiring more people. He realized that the best he could do was to narrow the gap a bit, getting the projects and his group's capacity to complete them to converge. A complete match was impossible. Bruce decided to move as many non-critical tasks as possible to other groups in the company, groups less qualified for them than his own, but also less busy. He also made arrangements with his manager to bring a summer student on board to help with some easily definable tasks. Then he set himself up to monitor the performance of his group tightly. He also proceeded to look at other avenues that could help him in the longer term, such as splitting the job of completing some of the work with other similar marketing groups in the company and eliminating any duplication of effort between them. Finally, Bruce initiated a request to increase the size of his organization. His plan, and the obvious reality that full convergence between his tasks and his capabilities was not possible even after going the extra mile, would lay the basis for his request. My second example involves Cindy, the middle manager and manufacturing process engineer whom we've met before. Cindy is responsible for maintaining and improving the process by which complex microchips are produced in a plant. She defines her environment as a collection of objects and influences. The objects are new processes and manufacturing tools that have not yet been tested in production. The influences are the people who can affect her work directly or indirectly. Development engineers, for example, would like her to require less experimentation and documentation before she chooses to implement new processes they have developed. Meanwhile, production engineers would like her to provide more experimentation and documentation on these same new processes. And finally, there are the product engineers eager to get chips out the door who need her help to do that, along with other members of the production team who put pressure on her to ensure that the new processes are manufacturable and the new manufacturing tools work as soon as they are put to use. Cindy herself works like a consultant, advising each group, influencing her, about whether something can go into production. She is the chief coordinator for the set of events required to put a product, a process, or a tool on stream. Her customer is the production area itself, and her vendors are the engineering groups from production, development, and product engineering. Analyzing her present status, Cindy found that the data and experimentation she needed from the development group always came in incomplete. Looking into matters further, she found that providing complete data and adhering to schedules were not really high on the development engineer's set of priorities. Determining where she needed to go, it was clear to Cindy that she must have all future new processes and production machinery tested, debugged, demonstrated, and most important, accompanied by the necessary data for them to be accepted and used by the production engineers, who had become more demanding because of past problems. Cindy then defined her strategy, her plan of action, to get there. She specified exactly what steps had to be completed before any new process was to be implemented or tool deployed. Then she used time offsets, as we did when we organized our breakfast factory, to determine when each step needed to be done in order for her entire plan to be completed on time. Next, she got the manager of the development engineers to agree to her detailed schedule. She negotiated with him what she had to do and what they had to do, and by what date, in order to meet what became the mutually agreed-upon goals. Finally, to ensure that she stayed on track, she decided to monitor all of her engineering group vendors on a weekly basis. She would also publish their performance against the schedule to motivate them to meet key dates. This comparison also served as an indicator to tell her about potential problems. It was a window into the black box of the production process she had set up. The key to both Bruce's and Cindy's efforts is that their planning produced tasks that had to be performed now in order to affect future events. I have seen far too many people who, upon recognizing today's gap, try very hard to determine what decision has to be made to close it. But today's gap represents a failure of planning sometime in the past. By analogy, forcing ourselves to concentrate on the decisions needed to fix today's problem is like scurrying after our car has already run out of gas. Clearly, we should have filled up earlier. To avoid such a fate, remember that as you plan, you must answer the question, what do I have to do today to solve, or better, avoid, tomorrow's problem? The true output of the planning process is the set of tasks it causes to be implemented. The output of Intel's annual plan, for instance, is the actions taken and changes prompted as a result of the thinking process that took place throughout the organization in order to write the plan. I, for one, hardly ever look at the bound volume finally called the annual plan. In other words, the output of the planning process is the decisions made and the actions taken as a result of the process. How far ahead should the planners look? At Intel, we put ourselves through an annual strategic long-range planning effort in which we examine our future 5 years off. But what is really being influenced here? It is the next year, and only the next year. We will have another chance to re-plan the second of the 5 years in the next year's long-range planning meeting, when that year will become the first year of the 5. So keep in mind that you implement only that portion of a plan that lies within the time window between now and the next time you go through the exercise. Everything else you can look at again. We should also be careful not to plan too frequently, allowing ourselves time to judge the impact of the decisions we made. Who should be involved in the planning process? The operating management of the organization. Why? Because the idea that planners can be people apart from those implementing the plan simply does not work. Finally, remember that by saying yes to projects or a course of action, you are implicitly saying no to something else. Each time you make a commitment, you forfeit your chance to commit to something else. People who plan have to have the guts, honesty, and discipline to drop projects as well as to initiate them, to shake their heads no, as well as to smile yes. Up to now, I've been talking mostly about long-term planning, but managers also have to apply the planning process to their daily work. This is where the idea of management by objectives comes in handy. The system of management by objectives assumes that because our concerns here are short range, we should know quite well what our environment demands from us. So, management by objectives, or MBO, concentrates on steps 2 and 3 of the planning process. Those steps are determining your present status and closing the gap. And MBO tries very hard to make those steps specific. The idea behind MBO is extremely simple. If you don't know where you are going, you will not get there. A successful MBO system needs only to answer 2 questions. The first is, where do I want to go? The answer to this provides the objective. And the second question is, how will I pace myself to see if I am getting there? The answer to this gives us milestones or key results. To illustrate an objective and a key result, consider the following. I want to go to the airport to catch a plane in an hour. That is my objective. I know that I must drive through towns A, B, and C on my way there. My key results become reaching A, B, and C in 10, 20, and 30 minutes, respectively. If I have been driving for 20 minutes and haven't yet made town A, I know I'm lost. Unless I get off the highway and ask someone for directions, I probably won't make my flight. MBO is largely designed to provide feedback relevant to the specific task at hand. It should tell us how we are doing so we can make adjustments in whatever we are doing if need be, such as getting off the highway and asking for directions. For the feedback to be effective, it must be received very soon after the activity it is measuring occurs. If we plan on a yearly basis, the corresponding MBO system's time frame should be at least as often as quarterly, or perhaps even monthly. The one thing an MBO system should provide par excellence is focus. This can only happen if we keep the number of objectives small. In practice, this is rare, and here as elsewhere, we fall victim to our inability to say no. We must realize and act on the realization that if we try to focus on everything, we focus on nothing. To familiarize ourselves with the MBO system, let's look at a case history. It's Columbus's discovery of the New World, though how I tell the story takes considerable liberties with the grammar school version. Thanks to its annual planning process of 1491, the government of Spain concluded that it could not continue a war everybody felt was utterly necessary unless money became available to buy weapons and ammunition. Since pushing the Moors out of Spain was the supreme goal of Queen Isabella's government, the Queen needed the funds to do it. Isabella decided she would get money by dramatically improving Spain's foreign trade balance. She then talked to her subordinate, Christopher Columbus, and told him about her objective. Columbus agreed to think about various ways to do what she wanted, and after a time went back to her with several suggestions, which included finding pirate-free passage to England and perhaps finding a new route to the Orient. Isabella and Columbus discussed the entire matter freely, eventually reaching a clear decision that he would look for a new route to the east. Once the decision was made, Columbus began to think of all the things that he would need to do to accomplish his intent. In MBO terms, the Queen defined her own objective, which was to increase Spain's wealth. Columbus and the Queen then agreed upon his objective, which was to find a new route to the Orient. Columbus then went on to formulate the key results by which he would pace himself, which included obtaining several ships, training crews, conducting a shakedown cruise, setting sail, and so forth, with each possessing a specific deadline. The relationship between Isabella's and Columbus's objectives is clear. The Queen wanted to increase her nation's wealth, while Columbus wanted to find a safe trade route to the Orient. And we see a nesting hierarchy of objectives. If the subordinates' objectives are met, the supervisors will be as well. Now, the key results can come in like clockwork, but the objectives can still be missed. For Columbus, the key results were relatively easy to achieve, but he most certainly did not find a new trade route to China, and therefore failed to meet his objective. Did Columbus perform well, even though he failed by strict MBO terms? He did discover the New World, and that was a source of incalculable wealth for Spain. So it is entirely possible for a subordinate to perform well and be rated well, even though he missed his specific objective. The MBO system is meant to pace people, to put stopwatches in their hand so they can gauge their own performances. It is not a legal document upon which to base performance reviews, but should be just one input used to determine how well individuals are doing. If supervisors mechanically rely on the MBO system to evaluate their subordinates' performance, or if the subordinates use it rigidly and forego taking advantage of emerging opportunities because they aren't specified objectives or key results, then both are behaving in a petty and unprofessional fashion. Let's illustrate the workings of the MBO system using the decision about Intel's plant expansion in the Philippines that I described earlier. The Far East construction manager had an objective that read, "Obtain decision on Philippine plant expansion." The key results supporting the objective were, do a study of land availability near the present plant and at other acceptable locations by June. Do financial analyses showing the trade-offs between land costs and construction costs, as well as the operating costs associated with the two locations. Present the results to the plant location steering group and obtain a decision from them. And have Grove ratify the decision by October. Each key result was accomplished, and the objective was met. Note that the objective is relatively short range, and the key results are so specific that a person knows without question whether he has completed them and done it on time or not. As you might have guessed, the Far East construction manager's supervisor had an objective that read, ensure that all plant expansion projects stay on schedule. To support this objective, he in turn had a key result, much like his subordinate's objective, that said, obtain Philippine plant expansion decision by October. You can now see, I hope, the parallels between how Queen Isabella's government and Intel work. Managers' objectives are supported by appropriate key results. These objectives, in turn, are tied to the manager's supervisor's objectives. If the managers meet their objectives, the supervisor's objectives will also be met. But the management by objectives system cannot be run mechanically by a computer. It requires your judgment and your common sense. The leverage tactics and the decision-making and planning processes that I've shown you all depend on your being an active participant in a team. But as a manager, you probably belong to more than one team in your company. And you are also responsible for making sure your team works productively with other teams. So at this point, let's go back to the example of the breakfast factory and see what it can show us about the roles managers have to fill as part of the total organization. We left the breakfast factory as it was enjoying great success. Like good entrepreneurs, we knew we had a good thing going, and we started another branch of the breakfast factory across town. This, too, became a remarkable success. Neighborhood Gourmet, a magazine with a large national circulation, ran a story on our operation. We decided to seize the opportunity and franchise the breakfast factory nationwide. We rapidly moved into neighborhoods with the right demographic mix for our breakfasts, and we were soon enough running a vast network of breakfast factories. Before long, we found, however, that the network required a set of tasks and skills very different from those needed to run our one restaurant. The most important of these was to figure out how to use the advantages made possible by having a local entrepreneur set up and run each franchise, without losing the enormous economies of scale that became available to us. Because the local managers know their neighborhoods, they can adapt their operations to them, and we hope operate the most profitable franchises possible. At the same time, with over 100 breakfast factories, our purchasing power is immense. If we centralize certain activities, we are in a position to do many things much better and much less expensively than each of our franchises could do individually. And most important, because the quality of our breakfasts has played a major role in our success so far, we have to be very concerned about maintaining a perception of first-rate food and service. In other words, we can't permit any breakfast factory branch to jeopardize the real secret of our business. In fact, the centralization-decentralization dichotomy has become one of the most important themes in the management of our network. Do we, for instance, want to advertise locally or nationally? Do we want to give local managers the control over advertising in their communities? We don't know who reads the Daily Blatt, and they probably do. Do we want to give them the right to hire and fire personnel? Should we let them set their wage scale, or do we want to impose one nationally? Imposing a wage scale hardly makes sense, since labor market conditions vary considerably from region to region. But we do want to buy our sophisticated automatic machinery centrally. After all, it has taken us a long time to develop suitable vendors and the capacity to test the incoming machines. We now have a sizable group of people doing only that in Chicago, and we hardly want each branch or even each region to duplicate the effort. But I don't think we should buy all our eggs in Chicago. We want them to be fresh, and we don't want to truck this delicate commodity all over the country. Neither do we want to have each branch set up its own egg inspection operation. Here, some kind of compromise makes sense, such as regional egg purchasing centers. We do want uniform, high-quality standards everywhere, and we will monitor each of the franchises to make sure that they are adhered to. In other words, we definitely want to impose national quality control standards. What about items on the menu? What about furniture? How do we choose the location of new franchises within each metropolitan area? Things have become very complicated. Sometimes as I sit behind my big desk at corporate headquarters, I wish I could go back to the early days when I was running a single breakfast factory and I knew everybody by name and could make all the decisions without having to struggle with a mountain of pros and cons. Then there was virtually no overhead. Now there's a corporate personnel manager. There's also a traffic manager who wants to buy a computer to optimize the flow of eggs from the regional centers to the individual franchises. He says he can minimize transportation costs while ensuring same-day delivery. It won't be long before we'll have a corporate manager for real estate acquisitions. Things will be very complicated indeed. Earlier, we established that the game of management is a team game. The output of managers is the output of the organizations under their supervision or influence. We now discover that management is not just a team game. It is a game in which we have to fashion a team of teams, where the various individual teams exist in some suitable and mutually supportive relationship with each other.
This completes Side 7 of High Output Management. Please fast forward this cassette to the end, then turn it over to hear Side 8. Welcome to Side 8 of High Output Management by Andrew S. Grove. On this side, we'll cover the two forms of organizations, the mission-oriented form and the functional form. Then we'll move on to the practice of dual reporting. Here is Side 8.
What happened to the breakfast factory has to happen, or has already happened, to every reasonably large organization. Most middle managers run departments that are a part of a larger organization. The black boxes, or production systems, they oversee are connected to other black boxes in much the same way that the breakfast factories are linked to each other and to the main office. So let us look more carefully at what happens within an organization composed of smaller units. Most organizations are a mixture of two forms, the mission-oriented form and the functional form. But they can also be extremes of one of these forms, becoming totally mission-oriented or totally functional. The extreme mission-oriented organization is completely decentralized. Each individual business unit pursues what it does, its mission, with little tie-in to the other units. If the breakfast factory corporation were organized this way, each breakfast factory would be responsible for all elements of its operation, determining its own location and constructing its own building, doing its own merchandising, acquiring and maintaining its own personnel, and doing its own purchasing. In the end, it would submit monthly financial statements to the corporate executive office. At the other extreme is the totally functional organization, which is completely centralized. In a breakfast factory corporation set up this way, the merchandising department would be responsible for merchandising at all locations. The staff of the personnel organization would hire, fire, and evaluate personnel at all branches, and so on. The desire to give individual branch managers the power to respond to local conditions moves us toward a mission-oriented organization. But a similarly legitimate desire to take advantage of the obvious economies of scale and to increase the leverage of the expertise we have in each operational area across the entire corporation pushes us toward a functional organization. In the real world, of course, we look for a compromise between the two extremes. Alfred Sloan summed up decades of experience at General Motors by saying, "Good management rests on a reconciliation of centralization and decentralization." Or we might say, on a balancing act to get the best combination of responsiveness and leverage. Intel is a hybrid organization because our form results from a mix of business divisions and functional groups. The business divisions at Intel are the Component Business Group, the Microcomputer Business Group, and the System Business Group. All three of these groups are mission-oriented. Then there are four functional groups: sales, manufacturing, technology development, and administration. Our mix of business and functional groups is much like the way I imagine an army is organized. The business divisions are analogous to individual fighting units, which are provided with blankets, paychecks, aerial surveillance, intelligence, and so forth by the functional organizations, which supply such services to all fighting units. Because each such unit does not have to maintain its own support groups, it can concentrate on a specific mission, like taking a hill in a battle. And for that, each unit has all the necessary freedom of action and independence. The functional groups can be viewed as if they were internal subcontractors. Some two-thirds of Intel's employees work in the functional units, indicating their enormous importance. What are some of the advantages of organizing so much of the company in such groups? The first is the economies of scale that can be achieved. Take the case of computerized information processing. Complex computer equipment is very expensive, and the capacity of large electronic machines can be best used if all the various business units draw from them. If each unit had its own computer, very expensive equipment would be sitting idle much of the time. Another important advantage is that resources can be shifted and reallocated to respond to changes in corporate-wide priorities. For instance, because manufacturing is organized functionally, we can change the mix of product being made to match need as perceived by the entire corporation. If each business unit did its own manufacturing, Shifting capacity away from one unit to another would be a cumbersome and sticky exercise. And the advantage here is that the expertise of specialists, know-how managers, such as the research engineers who work in technology development, can be applied across the breadth of the entire corporation, giving their knowledge and work enormous leverage. Finally, Intel's functional groups allow the business units to concentrate on mastering their specific trades rather than having to worry about computers, production, technology, and so forth. Having so much of Intel organized in functional units also has its disadvantages. The most important is the information overload hitting a functional group when it must respond to the demands made on it by diverse and numerous business units. Even conveying needs and demands often becomes very difficult. A business unit has to go through a number of management layers to influence decision-making in a functional group. Nowhere is this more evident than in the negotiations that go on to secure a portion of centralized and limited resources of the corporation, be it production capacity, computer time, or space in a shared building. Indeed, things often move beyond negotiation to intense and open competition among business units for the resources controlled by the functional groups. The bottom line here is that both the negotiation and competition waste time and energy because neither contributes to the output or the general good of the company. What are some of the advantages of organizing much of a company in a mission-oriented form? There is only one. It is that the individual units can stay in touch with the needs of their business or product areas and initiate changes rapidly when those needs change. That is it. All other considerations favor the functional type of organization. But the business of any business is to respond to the demands and needs of its environment, and the need to be responsive is so important that it always leads to much of any organization being grouped in mission-oriented units. Countless managers have tried to find the best mix of the two organizational forms, and it's been no different at Intel. But no matter how many times we have examined possible organizational forms, we have always concluded that there is simply no alternative to the hybrid organizational structure. In fact, just about every large company or enterprise that I know is organized in a hybrid form. And that has led me to come up with a principle which I call Grove's Law. Grove's Law states, all large organizations with a common business purpose end up in a hybrid organizational form. But the use of the hybrid organizational form does not even necessarily depend on how large a business or activity is. A friend of mine is a lawyer in a medium-sized law firm. He told me how his firm tried to deal with the problems and conflicts he and his colleagues were having over resources they all shared, such as the steno pool and office space. They ended up forming an executive committee that would not interfere with the legal, mission-oriented work of the individual attorneys, but would address the acquisition and allocation of common shared resources. Here is a small operation finding itself with the hybrid organizational form. Sooner or later, many companies must cope with the problems inherent in the workings of a hybrid organization. The most important task before such an organization is the optimum and timely allocation of its resources and the efficient resolution of conflicts arising over that allocation. Though this problem may be very complex, allocators working out of some central office are certainly not the answer. In fact, the most glaring example of inefficiency I've encountered went on some years ago in Hungary, where I once lived, and where a central planning organization decided what goods were to be produced, when, and where. The rationale for such planning was very solid, but in practice, it usually fell far, far short of meeting real consumer needs. In Hungary, I was an amateur photographer. During the winter, when I needed high-contrast film, none was to be found anywhere. Yet during the summer, everyone was up to his waist in the stuff, even though regular film was in short supply. Year after year, decision-making in the central planning organization was so clumsy that it could not even respond to totally predictable changes in demand. If we at Intel tried to resolve all conflicts and allocate all resources at the top, we would begin to resemble the group that ran the Hungarian economy. Instead, the answer lies with middle managers. Within a company, they are, in the first place, numerous enough to cover the entire range of operation, and in the second place, very close to the problem we're talking about, namely, generating internal resources and consuming those resources. For middle managers to succeed at this high-leverage task, two things are necessary. First, they must accept the inevitability of the hybrid organizational form if they are to serve its workings. Second, they must develop and master the practice through which a hybrid organization can be managed. This practice is dual reporting, and here's how it works. To put a man on the moon, NASA asked several major contractors and many subcontractors to work together, each on a different aspect of the project. An unintended consequence of the moonshot was the development of a new organizational approach, matrix management. This provided the means through which the work of various contractors could be coordinated and managed so that if problems developed in one place, they did not subvert the entire schedule. Resources could be diverted, for example, from a strong organization to one that was slipping in order to help the latter make up lost time. The core idea was that a project manager, somebody outside any of the contractors involved, could wield as much influence on the work of units within a given company as could the company management itself. NASA elaborated the principle of dual reporting on a grand scale, but in reality, the basic idea had been quietly at work for many years, enabling hybrid organizations of all types to function, from the neighborhood high school to Alfred Sloan's General Motors, not to mention the breakfast factory franchises. Let's recreate how Intel came to adopt a dual reporting system. When our company was young and small, we stumbled onto dual reporting almost by accident. At a staff meeting, we were trying to decide to whom the security personnel at our new outlying plants should report. We had two choices. One would have the employees report to the plant manager. But a plant manager, by background, is typically an engineer or a manufacturing person who knows very little about security issues and cares even less. The other choice would have them report to the security manager at the main plant. This manager hired them in the first place and is the expert who sets the standards that the security officers are supposed to adhere to throughout the company. And it was clear that security procedures and practices at the outlying plants had to conform to some kind of corporate standard. There was only one problem with the latter arrangement. The security manager works at corporate headquarters and not at the outlying plant. So this manager wouldn't know if the security personnel outside the main plant even showed up or came in late or otherwise performed badly. After we wrestled with the dilemma for a while, it occurred to us that perhaps security personnel should report jointly to the corporate security manager and to the local plant manager. The security manager would specify how the job ought to be done, and the plant manager would monitor how it was being performed day by day. While the arrangement seemed to solve both problems, the staff couldn't quite accept it. We found ourselves asking, a person has to have a boss, so who is in charge here? Could an employee have, in fact, two bosses? The answer was a tentative yes, and the culture of joint reporting relationships, dual reporting, was born. It was a slow, laborious birth, but the need for dual reporting is actually quite fundamental. Let's think for a minute about how managers come to be. They start their careers by being individual contributors, salespeople, for instance. If they prove to be superior salespeople, they are promoted to sales managers where they supervise people in their functional specialty, sales. When they have shown themselves to be superstar sales managers, they are promoted again, this time becoming regional sales managers. If they work at Intel, they are now not only supervising salespeople, but also field application engineers who obviously know more about technical matters than these regional managers do, but whom they still manage. The promotions continue until our superstars find themselves general managers of business divisions. Among other things, our new general managers have no experience with manufacturing, so while they are perfectly capable of supervising their manufacturing managers in the more general aspects of the jobs, The new bosses have no choice but to leave the technical aspects to their subordinates, because as graduates of sales, they have absolutely no background in manufacturing. In other divisions of the corporation, manufacturing managers may similarly be reporting to people who rose through the ranks of engineering and finance. We could handle the problem by designating one person the senior manufacturing manager and having all the manufacturing managers report to that person instead of to the general manager. But the more we do this, the more we move toward a totally functional form of organization. A general manager could no longer coordinate the activities of the finance, marketing, engineering, and manufacturing groups toward a single business purpose responsive to marketplace needs. We want the immediacy and the operating priorities coming from the general manager, as well as a technical supervisory relationship. The solution is dual reporting. But does the technical supervisor's role have to be filled by a single individual? No. Consider the following scenario, which could be taken from an ordinary day at Intel. Our manufacturing manager is sitting in the cafeteria having a cup of coffee, and the manufacturing manager from another division, whose boss, the general manager, has a finance background, comes over. They start chatting about what's going on in their respective divisions and begin to realize that they have a number of technical problems in common. Applying the theory that two heads are better than one, they decide to meet a bit more often. Eventually, the meetings become regularly scheduled, and manufacturing managers from other divisions join the two to exchange views about problems they share. Pretty soon, a committee or a council made up of a group of peers comes into existence to tackle issues common to all. In short, they have found a way to deal with those technical issues that their bosses, the general managers, can't help them with. In effect, they now have supervision that a general manager competent in manufacturing could have given them, but that supervision is being exercised by a peer group. The manufacturing managers report to two supervisors, to this group and to their respective general managers. To make such a body work requires the voluntary surrender of individual decision-making to the group. Being a member means you no longer have complete freedom of individual action, because you must go along with the decisions of your peers in most instances. By analogy, think of yourself as one of a couple who decides to take a vacation with another couple. You know that if you go together, you will not be free to do exactly what you want to do when you want to do it, but you go together anyway because you'll have more fun, even while you'll have less freedom. At work, surrendering individual decision-making depends on trusting the soundness of actions taken by your group of peers. Trust in no way relates to an organizational principle, but is instead an aspect of the corporate culture. Put simply, a corporate culture is a set of values and beliefs, as well as familiarity with the way things are done and should be done in a company. A strong and positive corporate culture is absolutely essential if dual reporting and decision-making by peers are to work. This system does make managers' lives ambiguous, and most people don't like ambiguity. People will strive to find something simpler. But the reality is that it doesn't exist. A strictly functional organization, which is clear conceptually, tends to remove engineering and manufacturing, or the equivalent groups in your firm, from the marketplace, leaving them with no idea of what the customers want. A highly mission-oriented organization, in turn, may have definite, crisp reporting relationships and clear and unambiguous objectives at all times. However, the fragmented state of affairs that results causes inefficiency and poor overall performance. It's not because Intel loved ambiguity that we became a hybrid organization. We have tried everything else, and while other models may have been less ambiguous, they simply didn't work. Hybrid organizations and the accompanying dual reporting principle, like a democracy, are not great in and of themselves. They just happen to be the best way for any business to be organized. To make hybrid organizations work, you need a way to coordinate the mission-oriented units and the functional groups so that the resources of the functional groups are allocated and delivered to meet the needs of the mission-oriented units. Consider advertising. Should each business division devise and pursue its own advertising campaign? Or should all of it be handled through a single corporate entity? There are pros and cons on both sides. Each division clearly understands its own strategy best, and therefore presumably best understands what its advertising message should be and to whom it should be aimed. This would suggest that advertising stay in the hands of the divisions. However, the products of various divisions often all serve the needs of a specific market, and taken together represent a much more complete solution to the customer's needs than what can be provided by an individual division. Here, the customer, and hence the manufacturer, clearly benefit if all the advertising stories are told in a coherent, coordinated fashion. Also, advertising sells not just a specific product, but the entire corporation as well. Because the ads ought to project a consistent image that is right for everybody, we should, at the very least, not let a division go out and hire its own advertising agency. As with much else in a hybrid organization, the optimum solution here calls for the use of dual reporting. The divisional marketing managers should control most of their own advertising messages, but a coordinating body of peers consisting of the various divisional marketing managers and perhaps chaired by the corporate merchandising manager should provide the necessary functional supervision for all involved. This body would choose the advertising agency, for instance, and determine the graphic image to which all divisional ads should conform. It could also define the way the division marketing managers would deal with the agency, which could reduce the cost of space through the use of volume buying. Yet the specific selling message communicated by an individual ad would be mainly left to the divisional people. Dual reporting can certainly tax the patience of the marketing managers, as they are now also required to understand the needs and thought processes of their peers. But no real alternative exists when you need to communicate individual product and market messages and maintain a corporate identity at the same time. Now, whenever people become involved in coordination, something not part of their regular daily work, we encounter a subtle variation of dual reporting. Remember Cindy, the know-how manager responsible for maintaining and improving a specific manufacturing process? Cindy reports to a supervising engineer, who in turn reports to the engineering manager of the plant. In her daily work, Cindy keeps things going by manipulating the manufacturing equipment, watching the process monitors, and making adjustments when necessary. But Cindy has another job, too. She meets formally once a month with her counterparts from the other production plants to identify, discuss, and solve problems related to the process for which they are each responsible in their respective plants. This coordinating group also works to standardize procedures used at all plants. The work of Cindy's group, and others like it, is supervised by another, more senior group called the Engineering Managers Council, which is made up of the engineering managers from all the plants. Again, we see dual reporting because Cindy has two supervisors. What's more, Cindy's two responsibilities won't fit on a single organization chart. Instead, we have to think of the coordinating group as existing on a different chart or on a different plane. This sounds complicated, but really isn't. If Cindy belonged to a church, she would be regarded as a member of that organization as well as being part of Intel. Her supervisor there would be the local pastor, who in turn is a member of the church hierarchy. No one would confuse these two roles. Clearly operating on two different planes, each has its own hierarchies, and that Cindy is a member of both groups at the same time would hardly trouble anyone. Cindy's being part of a coordinating group is like her church membership. Our ability to use Cindy's skill and know-how in two different capacities makes it possible for her to exert a much larger leverage at Intel. In her main job, her knowledge affects the work that takes place in one plant. In her second, through what she does in the process coordinating group, she can influence the work of all plants. So we see that the existence of such groups is a way for managers, especially know-how managers, to increase their leverage. The two-plane concept being used here is a part of everyday organizational life. For instance, while people mostly work at an operating task, they also plan. The hierarchy of the corporation's planning bodies flies on a plane separate from the one on which you'll find the operating groups. Moreover, if people can operate in 2 planes, they can operate in 3. Cindy could also be part of a task force to achieve a specific result in which her expertise is needed. This is as if Cindy were to work at Intel, to belong to a church, and to do advisory work for the town's parks department. These are separate roles and do not conflict with one another, though they all do vie for Cindy's time. It could also turn out that people who are in a subordinate supervisory relationship in one plane might find the relationship reversed in another. For example, I am president of Intel, but in another plane, I am a member of a strategic planning group where I report to its chairman, who is one of our division controllers. The 2-plane or multiplane organization is very useful. Without it, I could only participate if I were in charge of everything I was part of. I don't have that kind of time, and often I'm not the most qualified person around to lead. The multiplane organization enables me to serve as a foot soldier rather than as a general when appropriate and useful. This gives the organization important flexibility. Many of the groups that we are talking about here are temporary. Some, like task forces, are specifically formed for a purpose, while others are merely an informal collection of people who work together to solve a particular problem. Both cease to work as a group once the problem has been handled. The more varied the nature of the problems we face, and the more rapidly things change around us, the more we have to rely on such specially composed transitory teams. The techniques that we have to master to make hybrid organizations work, dual or multiple reporting, and also decision-making by peer groups, are both necessary if such transitory teams are to work. The key factor, common to all, is the use of cultural values as a mode of control. And the modes of control that you can use when you are a manager are what I want to tell you about next.
This completes Side 8 of Career Track's High Output Management by Andrew Grove. Please replace this cassette with Side 9 and continue. This is Side 9 of Career Track's High Output Management. In a work environment, our behavior can be controlled by three invisible and pervasive means: free market forces, contractual obligations, and cultural values. On this side, we'll discuss the importance of each. Then we'll turn our attention to the players on our teams and ask, what can managers do to help people achieve individual peak performances? Here is Side 9.
Let's look at the ways in which our actions can be controlled or influenced. Say you need new tires for your car. You go down the street to the dealer and take a look at the various lines he has to offer. Then you'll probably go up the street to see what the competition has. Maybe later you'll turn to a consumer magazine to help you choose. Eventually, you'll make a decision based on one thing: your own self-interest. You want to buy the tires you think will meet your needs at the lowest cost to you. You are not concerned about the tire dealer's welfare. There's not much chance that you would say to him that he isn't charging you enough for the tires. Now, you have the tires on your car, and you drive off. After a while, you come to a red light. You stop. Do you think about it? No. It's a law established by the society at large that everybody stops at a red light, and you unquestioningly accept and live by it. Vehicular chaos would reign if all drivers had not entered into a contract to stop. The traffic cop monitors adherence and penalizes those who break the law. After the light changes, you continue on down the road and come upon the scene of a major accident. Quite likely you'll forget about laws like not stopping on a freeway, and also forget about your own self-interest. You'll probably do everything you can to help the accident victims, and in the meantime, expose yourself to all kinds of dangers and risks. What motivates you now is not at all what did when you were shopping for tires or stopping at the red light. Not self-interest or obeying the law, but concern about someone else's life. Similarly, our behavior in a work environment can be controlled by three invisible and pervasive means. These are free market forces, contractual obligations, and cultural values. Looking first at the free market forces that came into place when you bought your tires, we can say that these forces are based on price. Goods and services are being exchanged between two entities, individuals, organizational units, or corporations, with each seeking only to enrich itself. This is very simple. It is a matter of, I want to buy the tire at the lowest price I can get, versus, I want to sell the tire at the highest price I can get. Neither party here cares if the other goes bankrupt, nor do they pretend to. This is a very efficient way to buy and sell tires. No one is needed to oversee the transaction because everyone is openly serving his own self-interest. So why aren't the forces of the marketplace used all the time in all circumstances? Because to work, the goods and services bought and sold must possess a very clearly defined dollar value. The free market can easily establish a price for something as simple as tires. But for much else that changes hands in a work or business environment, value is hard to establish. What happens, for instance, when it takes a group of people to accomplish a certain task? How much does each of them contribute to the value the business adds to the product? The point is that how much an engineer is worth in a group cannot be pinned down by appealing to the free market. In fact, if we bought engineering work by the bit, I think we would end up spending more time trying to decide the value of each bit of contribution than the contribution itself is worth. Here, trying to use free market concepts becomes quite inefficient. So you say to the engineers, okay, I'll retain your services for a year for a set amount of money, and you will agree to do a certain type of work in return. We've now entered into a contract. I'll give you an office and a terminal, and you promise me to do the best you can to perform your task. Control of behavior is now based on contractual obligations, which define the kind of work you will do and the standards that will govern it. Because I can't specify in advance exactly what you will do from day to day, I must have a fair amount of generalized authority over your work. So you must give to me, as part of the contract, the right to monitor and evaluate, and if necessary, correct your work. We agree on other guidelines and work out rules that we will both obey. In return for stopping at a red light, we count on other drivers to do the same thing, and we can drive through green lights. But for lawbreakers, we need policemen, and with them, as with supervisors, we introduce overhead. A utility company presents another example of contractual obligations. Its representatives will go to somebody who works for the government and say, I'll build a $300 million generating plant and provide electricity for this portion of the state if you promise me that no one else will build one and try to sell electricity here. The state says, well, that's fine, but we're not going to let you charge whatever you want for the power you generate. We'll establish a monitoring agency called the Public Utilities Commission, and they'll tell you how much you can charge consumers and how much profit you can make. So, in exchange for a monopoly, the company is contractually obliged to accept the government's decision on pricing and profit. When the environment changes more rapidly than one can change rules, or when a set of circumstances is so ambiguous and unclear that a contract between the parties that attempted to cover all possibilities would be prohibitively complicated, we need another mode of control, one which is based on cultural values. Its most important characteristic is that the interest of the larger group to which an individual belongs takes precedence over the interest of the individual himself. When cultural values are at work, some emotionally loaded words come into play. Words like trust, because you are surrendering to the group your ability to protect yourself. And for this to happen, you must believe that you all share a common set of values, a common set of objectives, and a common set of methods. These, in turn, can only be developed by a great deal of common, shared experience. What are the roles of managers when it comes to putting these behavioral controls into practice? Well, you don't need managers to supervise the workings of free market forces. In a contractual obligation, however, managers have a role in setting and modifying the rules, monitoring adherence to them, and evaluating and improving performance. As for cultural values, managers have to develop and nurture the common set of values, objectives, and methods essential for the existence of trust. How do we do that? One way is by articulation, by spelling out these values, objectives, and methods. The other, even more important way, is by example. If our behavior at work is seen to be in line with the values we profess, that fosters the development of a group culture. There is a temptation to idealize what I've called cultural values as a mode of control because it is so nice, even utopian, because everybody presumably cares about the common good and subjugates self-interest to that common good. But this is not the most efficient mode of control under all conditions. It is no guide to buying tires, nor could awarding monopolies work this way. Accordingly, given a certain set of conditions, there is always a most appropriate mode of control, which we as managers should find and use. How do we do that? There are two variables here. The first variable is the nature of a person's motivation. It can range from self-interest to group interest. The second variable is the nature of the environment in which a person works. How much complexity, uncertainty, and ambiguity does it have? Cindy, the process engineer, is surrounded by tricky technologies, new and not fully operational equipment, and development engineers and production engineers pulling her in opposite directions. Her working environment, in short, is complex. Bruce, the marketing manager, has asked for permission to hire more people for his grossly understaffed group. His supervisor waffles, and Bruce is left with no idea if he'll get the go-ahead or what to do if he doesn't. Bruce's working environment is uncertain. Mike, whom we will now introduce as an Intel transportation supervisor, had to deal with so many committees, councils, and divisional manufacturing managers that he didn't know which, if any, end was up. He eventually quit, unable to tolerate the ambiguity of his working environment. I call complexity, uncertainty, and ambiguity the CUA factor in a person's environment. This factor can range from low to high. When self-interest is high and the CUA factor is low, the most appropriate mode of control is the market mode, which governed our tire purchase. As self-interest moves toward group interest, the contractual mode, which governed our stopping for a red light, becomes appropriate. When group interest and the CUA factor are both high, the cultural values mode becomes the best choice, which explains to us why we tried to help at the scene of the accident. And finally, when the CUA factor is high and individual motivation is based on self-interest, no mode of control will work well. This situation, like every man for himself on a sinking ship, can only produce chaos. Let's apply our model to the work of a new employee. What is his motivation? It is very much based on self-interest. So you should give him a clearly structured job with a low CUA factor. If he does well, he will begin to feel more at home, worry less about himself, and start to care more about his team. He learns that if he is on a boat and wants to get ahead, it is better for him to help row than to run to the bow. The employee can then be promoted into a more complex, uncertain, ambiguous job. These tend to pay more. As time passes, he will continue to gain an increasing amount of shared experience with other members of the organization and will be ready to tackle more and more complex, ambiguous, and uncertain tasks. This is why promotion from within tends to be the approach favored by corporations with strong corporate cultures. Bring young people in at relatively low-level, well-defined jobs with low CUA factors, and over time they will share experiences with their peers, supervisors, and subordinates, and will learn the values, objectives, and methods of the organization. They will gradually accept, even flourish in, the complex world of multiple bosses and peer decision-making. But what do we do when, for some reason, we have to hire a senior person from outside the company? Like any other new hire, he too will come in having high self-interest. But inevitably, we will give him an organization to manage that is in trouble. After all, that was our reason for going outside. So not only does our new manager have a tough job facing him, but his working environment will have a very high CUA. Meanwhile, he has no base of common experience with the rest of the organization and no knowledge of the methods used to help him work. All we can do is cross our fingers and hope he quickly forgets self-interest and just as quickly gets on top of his job to reduce his CUA factor. Short of that, he's probably out of luck. Let's now consider what goes on during the course of a work project. Barbara's department is responsible for training the Intel sales force in her division's products. When she buys materials used in the training program, free market forces reign as binders of the required quality are purchased at the lowest possible price. The existence of the training program itself, however, presents an example of contractual obligations at work. The salespeople expect that each division will provide training on a regular basis. While the program isn't a mandated requirement spelled out somewhere in a formal policy statement, its basis is nonetheless contractual. The point is, expectations can be as binding as a legal document. When a number of divisions share a common sales force, each of them has a vested interest to train representatives to promote and sell its products. At the same time, unless the divisions are willing to sacrifice self-interest in favor of the common interest, the training sessions can easily become disjointed free-for-alls and confuse everybody. So the need to have the individual divisions present coordinated messages is governed by corporate values. Thus, in field sales training, we find all three modes of control at work. Recently, a group of factory marketing managers claimed that our salespeople were governed only by self-interest. They said that they devoted most of their attention to selling those items that produced the most commissions and bonuses. Irritated and a bit self-righteous, the managers felt they were much more concerned about the common good of the company than were their colleagues in the field. But the marketing departments themselves created the monster. To get the sales force to favor particular products, the divisions had been running contests with prizes ranging from cash bonuses to trips to exotic places. The marketing managers were competing against one another for a finite and valuable resource, the salespeople's time. And the salespeople merely responded as one might expect. But salespeople can also behave in the opposite fashion. At one time, one of our divisions had serious problems, leaving the sales engineers with no product to sell for nearly a year. They could have left Intel and immediately gotten other jobs and quick commissions elsewhere, but by and large they stayed with us. They stayed because they believed in the company and had faith that eventually things would get better. Belief and faith are not aspects of the market mode, but stem from adherence to cultural values. Earlier, I built a case summed up by the key sentence, "The output of managers is the output of the organizations under their supervision or influence." Put another way, this means that management is a team activity. But no matter how well a team is put together, no matter how well it is directed, the team will perform only as well as the individuals on it. In other words, everything we've considered so far is useless unless the members of our team will continually try to do their best. So let's turn our attention to the players on our teams and ask, what can managers do to help people to achieve individual peak performances? We'll talk here about finding best ways to motivate people, about choosing the management style that will match the special needs of subordinates, and about using performance reviews effectively. Then I'll give you my insights into two tasks that I find particularly difficult: interviewing potential employees and trying to talk valued employees out of quitting. And finally, we'll discuss how you can use the way you compensate employees to give them feedback about their performances. When a person is not doing his job, there can only be two reasons for it. The person either can't do it or won't do it. He is either not capable or not motivated. To determine which, we can employ a simple mental test. If the person's life depended on doing the work, could he do it? If the answer is yes, that person is not motivated. If the answer is no, he is not capable. If my life depended on playing the violin on command, I could not do it. But if I had to run a mile in 6 minutes, I probably could. Not that I would want to, but if my life depended on it, I probably could. The single most important task of managers is to elicit peak performance from their subordinates. So if lack of capability or lack of motivation are the two things that limit high output, managers have two ways to tackle the issue: through training and through motivation. Right now, I'd like to focus on motivation. How do managers motivate subordinates? For most of us, the word motivate implies doing something to another person. But I think motivation has to come from within somebody. Accordingly, all a manager can do is create an environment in which motivated people can flourish. Because better motivation means better performance, not a change of attitude or feeling. Subordinates saying, "I feel motivated," means nothing. What matters if they perform better or worse because their environment changed. An attitude may constitute an indicator, a window into the black box of human motivation, but it is not the desired result or output. Better performance at a given skill level is. For most of Western history, including the early days of the Industrial Revolution, motivation was based mostly on fear of punishment. In Charles Dickens' time, the threat of loss of life got people to work, because if people did not work, they were not paid and could not buy food. and if they stole food and got caught, they were hanged. The fear of punishment indirectly caused them to produce more than they might have otherwise. Over the past 30 years or so, a number of new approaches have begun to replace older practices keyed to fear, because the emergence of the new humanistic approaches to motivation can be traced to the decline in the relative importance of manual labor and the corresponding rise in the importance of so-called knowledge workers. The output of a manual laborer is readily measurable, and departures from the expected can be spotted and dealt with immediately. But for a knowledge worker, such departures take longer to determine because even the expectations themselves are very difficult to state precisely. In other words, fear won't work as well with computer architects as with galley slaves. Hence, new approaches to motivation are needed. My description of what makes people perform relies heavily on Abraham Maslow's theory of motivation, simply because my own observations of working life confirm Maslow's concepts. For Maslow, motivation is closely tied to the idea of needs, which cause people to have drives, which in turn result in motivation. A need, once satisfied, stops being a need, and therefore stops being a source of motivation. Simply put, if we are to create and maintain a high degree of motivation, we must keep some needs unsatisfied at all times. People, of course, tend to have a variety of concurrent needs, but one among them is always stronger than the others, and that need is the one that largely determines an individual's motivation, and therefore his or her level of performance. Maslow defined a set of needs that lie in a hierarchy. When a lower need is satisfied, one higher is likely to take over. The lowest needs, that is, our most basic needs, are our physiological needs. These are things that money can buy, like food, clothing, and other basic necessities of life. Fear is hitched to such needs. One fears the possible deprivation of food, clothing, and other basic needs. Once our physiological needs are taken care of, our security and safety needs become strong. These needs come from a desire to protect ourselves from slipping back to being deprived of the basic necessities. Safety and security needs are fulfilled, for example, when medical insurance provides employees protection against the fear of going bankrupt trying to pay doctor and hospital fees. The existence of benefits is rarely a dominant source of employee motivation, but if benefits were absent and employees had to worry about such concerns, performance would no doubt be badly affected. Taking another step up in the hierarchy of needs brings us to our social and affiliation needs. The social needs stem from the inherent desire of human beings to belong to some group or other. But people don't want to belong to just any group. They need to belong to one whose members possess something in common with themselves. Another example of the power of social needs is provided by Jim, a young engineer. His first job after he graduated from college was with a very large, long-established company, while his two college roommates came to work at Intel. Because Jim continued to room with them, he was exposed to what working within Intel was like. Moreover, most of his roommates' friends from work were also young, unmarried, and just a year or two out of college, while most of the people where Jim worked were married and at least 10 years older. Jim felt left out, and his need for a group in which he felt comfortable prompted him to come to work at Intel, though he very much enjoyed his work at the other company. As one's environment or condition in life changes, one's desire to satisfy a particular set of needs is replaced by a desire to satisfy another set. There's the story of a young Intel manager, Chuck, when he was a first-year student at the Harvard Business School. Initially, he was engulfed by a fear of the class material, of his professors, of failure, of flunking out. After a while, his fear gave way to the realization that everyone else was in the same boat, also afraid. Students began to form study groups whose ostensible purpose was to consider class material together, but whose real purpose was to strengthen confidence. Chuck moved from being governed largely by his need for sheer survival, a physiological need, to one for security and safety. As time went on, the study groups dissolved and the students started to associate with other members of the class. The entire class, or section as it was called, developed a definite and recognizable set of characteristics. It became, in short, a team. Members enjoyed belonging, associating, and identifying with it, and worked to sustain the section's image among the professors and other students. Chuck was now satisfying his need for affiliation. Of course, regressive movement is also possible. Recently, a highly motivated, smoothly working team of manufacturing employees in one of our California plants was suddenly jolted, all too literally, from satisfying a very high level of human needs to abandoning an inventory of silicone wafers, expensive manufacturing equipment, even friends. An earthquake shook their factory. People feared for their lives, dropped everything, and ran to the nearest exit as they found themselves totally consumed by the most fundamental of all physiological needs, survival. The physiological, safety, security, and social needs all can motivate us to show up for work. But other needs make us perform once we are there. These other needs are esteem and recognition, and their strength is readily apparent in the cliché, keeping up with the Joneses. Such striving is commonly frowned upon, but if an athlete's Jones is last year's Olympic gold medalist, or if an actor's Jones is Laurence Olivier, the need to keep up with or emulate someone is a powerful source of positive motivation. The person or group whose recognition you desire may mean nothing to someone else. Esteem exists in the eyes of the beholder. If you are an aspiring high school athlete and one of the top players passes you in the hall and says hello, you'll feel terrific. Yet, if you try to tell your family or friends how pleased you were about the encounter, you are likely to be met with blank stares, because the hello means nothing to people who are not aspiring athletes in your high school. All of the sources of motivation we've talked about so far are self-limiting. That is, when a need is gratified, it can no longer motivate a person. Once a predetermined goal or level of achievement is reached, the need to go any further loses urgency. A friend of mine was thrust into a premature midlife crisis when, in recognition of the excellent work he had been doing, he was named a vice president of the corporation. Such a position had been a lifelong goal. When he had suddenly attained it, he found himself looking for some other way to motivate himself. Another set of needs that helps us perform, and that are even more powerful than esteem and recognition, are our self-actualization needs. They are at the top of the hierarchy we've been talking about. For Maslow, self-actualization stems from a personal realization that what I can be, I must be. The title of a movie about athletes, Personal Best, captures what self-actualization means: the need to achieve one's utter personal best in a chosen field of endeavor. Once the source of motivation is self-actualization, the drive to perform has no limit. Thus, its most important characteristic is that, unlike other sources of motivation, which extinguish themselves after the needs are fulfilled, self-actualization continues to motivate people to ever higher levels of performance. Two inner forces can drive people to use all of their capabilities. They can be competence-driven or achievement-driven. The former, competence-driven, concerns itself with job or task mastery. A virtuoso violinist who continues to practice day after day is obviously moved by something other than a need for esteem and recognition. She works to sharpen her own skill, trying to do a little bit better this time than the time before. Just as a teenager on a skateboard practices the same trick over and over again. The same teenager may not sit still for 10 minutes to do homework, but on a skateboard he is relentless, driven by the self-actualization need, a need to get better that has no limit. That's being competence-driven. The achievement-driven path to self-actualization is not quite like this. Some people, not the majority, are moved by an abstract need to achieve in all that they do. A psychology lab experiment illustrated the behavior of such people. Some volunteers were put into a room in which pegs were set at various places on the floor. Each person was given some rings, but not instructed what to do with them. People eventually started to toss the rings onto the pegs. Some casually tossed the rings at faraway pegs. Others stood over the pegs and dropped the rings down onto them. Still others walked just far enough away from the pegs so that to toss a ring onto a peg constituted a challenge. These people worked at the boundary of their capability. Researchers classified the three types of behavior. The first group, casually tossing the rings at faraway pegs, were termed gamblers. They took high risks but exerted no influence on the outcome of events. The second group, who stood over the pegs and dropped the rings down onto them, termed conservatives, were people who took very little risk. The third group, who walked just far enough away from the pegs so that to toss the ring onto a peg constituted a challenge, were termed achievers. They had to test the limits of what they could do, and with no prompting, demonstrated the point of the experiment, namely, that some people simply must test themselves. By challenging themselves, these people were likely to miss a peg several times, but when they began to ring the peg consistently, they gained satisfaction and a sense of achievement. The point is that both competence and achievement-oriented people spontaneously try to test the outer limits of their abilities. When the need to stretch is not spontaneous, management needs to create an environment to foster it. In a management by objectives, MBO system, for example, objectives should be set at a point high enough so that even if the individuals or organizations push themselves hard, they will still only have a 50-50 chance of making them. Output will tend to be greater when people strive for a level of achievement beyond their immediate grasp, even though trying means failure half the time. Such goal setting is extremely important if what you want is peak performance from yourself and your subordinates. Moreover, if we want to cultivate achievement-driven motivation, we need to create an environment that values and emphasizes output. My first job was with a research and development laboratory, where a lot of people were very highly motivated but tended to be knowledge-centered. They were driven to know more, but not necessarily to know more in order to produce concrete results. Consequently, relatively little was actually achieved. The value system at Intel is completely the reverse. The PhD in computer science who knows an answer in the abstract, yet does not apply it to create some tangible output, gets little recognition. But a junior engineer who produces results is highly valued and esteemed, and that is how it should be.
This completes Side 9 of High Output Management by Andrew S. Grove. On the next side, we'll address the subject of what motivates people to levels of peak performance in the workplace. Is it money, recognition, a fear of failure? We'll find out on the next side. Now, please fast forward this cassette to the end, then turn it over to hear Side 10.